Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Event Industry News Podcast with me, James Dickson, wishing you all a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever or wherever you've tuned into today's podcast from. I say this quite often on the podcast, that it feels like ages since we've done them. And as many of our podcast followers will know, we record our podcasts in batches. So I'll sit down and record 5, 6, 7 episodes in one particular day. So it could be that we go for a month or so without actually recording these. So it's great to be back behind the mic again and talking to some great guests on today's recordings. And today's guest is Hellen Beveridge. Hellen is from Data Oversight, a data compliance officer. Maybe I've got that completely and wildly wrong, but Hellen, welcome to the podcast today.
Good morning, James. You did indeed. I'm a data privacy lead, and for some organisations, I operate as a data protection officer.
And straight away, I can feel the shudders and the shivers going down the spines of our podcast followers who are listening, thinking, data, that horrible word, data, and a data compliance officer. Oh, this is going to be somebody who's going to come in and shut my organisation down. It is something that scares people, particularly in the last couple of years, isn't it? People have really got themselves in a bit of a tiz over data.
Well, I think that they got themselves in a bit of a tiz about the fact that somebody's telling them what to do with their data. I mean, the majority of event companies know that data is their most valuable asset. You know, if you sell an event company, if you sell an event, you sell essentially the data. But it's the first time somebody has come up behind them with a big stick, because data protection has been around for a very long time, and the data protection. Previous Data Protection Act was enacted in 1998. We had 20 years to kind of sort our lives out, but kind of ignored it a bit. Well, quite a lot actually. So you know, policymakers said, well, look, we asked you to do this 20 years ago because we kind of sort of saw this coming, and you ignored us, and so we're going to make you, and we're going to come up with some happy little wheezes that are really going to make you. The key one, which of course was really focused and concentrated the mind, was making directors of companies, trustees, etc., personally and severally liable for the fines.
Absolutely, yeah. And we had those wonderful letters come in a few years ago, and we are 2 minutes and 45 seconds into the podcast, and I'm going to say the letters GDPR, which came in. But as you and I have spoken about before, and we should reference the fact that Hellen and I were both at a masterclass for exhibitors of Event Tech Live a few weeks ago, during which Hellen spoke about data compliance and GDPR and all those things that we're probably going to talk about on today's podcast. And one of the things that you said during that masterclass day is that GDPR is not the only thing to worry about as far as data is concerned. There is other legislation that's still applicable, isn't there?
There's loads actually, and one that hasn't changed. We had a slight tweak on the 13th of December last year. Is what's known as PECR, the Personal Electronic Communications Regulations, PECR, that's what deals with electronic communications. So there's a fancy little term. It's known as a lex specialis, so a specialist law.
Right.
And that sits on top of the GDPR. It trumps the GDPR. It trumps the Data Protection Act. And it's all to do with the method of communication. So if you kind of think about GDPR, Data Protection Act deals with how, why, where, the functionality of collecting and using data.
Mm-hmm.
So what the PECR does is it takes out the little bit where you communicate electronically and says, but if you're going to do these things, you have some additional rules. So that is like a soft opt-in for B2B email communications or cookie regulations and all of those kind of things. They all sit within PECR.
Right.
So there's some crossover because whether you were able to use the data in the first place sits within the GDPR and then the PECR. Then there's also some other nice little things. One is the Misuse of Computers Act. So that is the law that is used if somebody runs away with your sales database. So that's how people get prosecuted under that. Then there are it doesn't affect the events industry so much, but there are other rules with regards to specialist types of data. and how those are used.
Mm-hmm.
But you can all breathe a sigh of relief, because I don't know anybody who would need those particular types of data in the event industry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the things, again, this is something that was touched on at the Masterclass a few weeks ago, is that there was this worry in the events industry, particularly when GDPR came in, that suddenly everybody's data was going to be obsolete and they would have to essentially start from ground zero again. People telling people that, oh, you can't use that anymore, you can't market to these people, you can't send emails, you can't do this. And a lot of that was maybe dispelled is not the right way to phrase it, but certainly that's something that you addressed, and I presume you've probably addressed a lot with event professionals in the last couple of years.
Yeah. So there were lots of misconceptions. There were lots of people who, in order to fix their problem, then, as if you remember from my little Adam Stickman presentation,
Yes.
Adam goes for a quick look on the interweb. And that's what lots of people did. They went, shit. Sorry. There's this big piece of legislation coming in. I need to fix it, and I need to fix it quickly. And so they went and grabbed the little bits of commentary that they thought applied to them, and that they thought would enable them to fix their problem quickly and easily.
Yeah.
And so what that then happened was then that they weren't looking at the veracity. They were a little bit foxed by fake news.
Yeah.
And so they weren't checking the veracity of what they were looking at, and they were taking bite-sized pieces of advice. The GDPR itself is a big bit of legislation. It's actually really well nicely written. You can understand it even as a non-lawyer, as opposed to the Data Protection Act, which, unless you've got half 100 weighted post-it notes to mark every page and every reference, is just like. Anyway, so by not being thoughtful, they enabled themselves to be manipulated by the narrative that was created by people with ulterior motives, or the one fact expert. And we all know that, in the land of the blind, the one fact expert is king. So you kind of like, so that's what they did. They ran to what they thought was their quickest fix. And now we're starting to see them unpick. And the case was that there were companies that hadn't collected their data previously in a compliant manner.
Yeah.
But they also didn't see that data protection legislation it's risk-based. So somebody described it as health and safety for data, and best possible efforts, and but also looking at the type of data that you hold. Now, if you hold company name and email address on a B2B database, the risk of that data is really, really, really low.
Right.
But equally, if that database is 100,000 records big, and some of those people have been on the database without having any interaction with you for 10 years, then you did have to do some work.
Yeah.
But in this rush to kind of get to the end point quickly, that thoughtfulness and that need to do the work disappeared. And then what we've also seen is organisations that confuse compliance with control. And by that, I know you've heard me talk about this before, but by that it meant that if I put in place the fact that my staff can't do this, and this, I am compliant.
Right.
No, not really. Because what you've done then is you haven't gone and looked thoughtfully and carefully and in a granular manner about how you deal with every single bit of your data.
Sure.
So, for example, if I asked you how many data sets do you have in your business, you might say, I've got one. I've got customers.
Yeah.
Well, you've got at least two, because you've got employees as well. And then say, what kind of customers have you got? And you say, well, I've got PR customers, and I've got event management companies, and I've got, all these. You say, well, okay, well, that's immediately lots of different data categories, because you don't do the same thing with all of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was that. So yeah, at length, I've gone into one of my biggest bugbears. You shouldn't have started me off on this particular subject.
No. We absolutely should do that. That's why we've got you on the podcast today. It's perhaps talk about the stuff that people are not aware of. And one correlation that I made when we were going through the sort of getting ready for GDPR and the date looming, it reminded me very much of something that happened with the event industry a few years previous, which was introduction of CDM regulations as far as the build of live events was concerned, and changes to regulations. And without getting bogged down into that and the details of that, one thing that came about the discussions and the podcasts that we did around that whole subject was a lot of people said to me that if an organization was fundamentally operating really well and doing things in a safe and appropriate manner, the introduction of these new regulations as far as building live events would not really affect them. It would only affect the people who weren't really doing it in a correct manner to begin with. And to me, that strikes me that there are a lot of similarities with the whole data side of things, is that the organizations, the people who got really worried about this were perhaps organizations that, as you said, hadn't really been taking care of their data and doing it in an appropriate manner for a long period of time, which gave them concern with the new regulations coming in. Those who had been looking after their data properly and appropriately and gathering it and obtaining it in the correct manner with the right consent perhaps had very little to worry about when these new regulations came in. I don't know what you think about the sort of similarities between the introduction of the two things.
I think it's a yes and no. With operations, you have an ops manager and they have a process and procedure and good procurement. Mm-hmm. And they are the only people that do it. And therefore, their expertise is very embedded in that area. They have, IOSH qualifications and
sure, yeah,
etc. So they were already in quite a regulated framework. So the introduction of tweaking of that regulatory framework was it was a reasonably large step, but it was a step that felt within reach. With data, the way that businesses manage data come very much as a result of the democratization of technology. Mm-hmm. And by that, what I mean is that everybody thinks they're an expert. And because we all use technology, we all use a smartphone, we can all upload Office 365 onto our PC, we can all go and find royalty-free photography on the internet, we can all go and do a bit of scrape of LinkedIn, we can all do that. So and we like shiny things, and I can say this as an ex-marketeer. Marketeers love shiny things. They really, really do. And what happened with the procurement of technologies to support the data effort is it was also democratized, which meant that the procurement was incredibly sloppy. So the big things that I've had to unpick is going into business and saying, where is your data going? And they say, well, we put it into Destra, and then we've got it in Marketo, and then we've got it here and here and here. They, okay, so who did the procurement of those things? And they go, we don't know. Please show me the contract. Not sure we've got one. So who's your lead contact at that organisation that's got your data? Not a clue. Because the procurement has got, there was no process. There was no diligence, and it's enabled amazing fleet of foot. It's enabled fantastic things to happen. But what it means is that you've scattered seeds, and you've got no idea where they are. You've got no idea what's going to come up. Yeah. You've got no idea how to look after them. No idea how many copies of the same thing you've got. It's out of control. Yeah. And that is the bigger difference. I'm trying to, our cat analogy that we used earlier when we were chatting, trying to put your kittens in a box. Yeah. When you actually don't know how many kittens, they're feral. You don't know how many kittens you've got. At no point, that they started multiplying so fast and so quickly that at one point you decided to stop counting. And so that is what has happened with data. And so the introduction of something which said, you know what, guys, you need to know every bit of data. everywhere it goes, everywhere it sits, everyone who's using it, everyone you're sharing it with, just like, oh, where are those kittens?
Yeah, yeah, and it's so relevant, isn't it, to this particular industry because of the way now that data is used. You know, if you go back and just referencing what you were saying about the Data Protection Act, and the previous Data Protection Act came into effect, you know, around about 20 years ago. If you think back 20 years, how event organisers were marketing events.
Well, I can tell you because I was doing it.
Well, exactly. Even email was in its relative infancy. You know,
I was,
you might.
yeah. I can say I tell a story to people to tell them quite how old I was. That I was a pioneer. I sent out my first email campaign, and I had 350 emails on it, and it went from my Outlook, and I created a static web page for my event, and that I had to really convince the event management team that this was a good thing to do, and it cost £4,500 for 5 static pages. So
Well, and there you go. That this is we've moved in such a relatively short period of time, so dramatically when it comes to the data that we have available. As I said, 20 years ago, you might have been lucky to have an Excel spreadsheet. The likelihood is people still probably had a Rolodex or a plastic box with a load of contact cards in, and they would mail out printed invitations to their trade show or to their conference or to their event, you know, and we have moved on so quickly. Something had to change, didn't it, regulatively speaking, because 20 years ago we were dealing with data in such a different way that the laws as they were then 20 years ago when the last Data Protection Act came in, probably, and you've looked through this and I haven't, they probably don't cover anything like what we now deal with. And especially if I think about the different platforms, you know, most event organisers now are not just dealing with one database, they're probably dealing with half a dozen at least different technology providers who are delivering some form of service relevant to their visitors, and they're all handling the data. Something had to change, didn't it?
It did really, and I think listen to Elizabeth Denham, who's the Information Commissioner, on a number of occasions, and she said there really and truly is only one thing that the GDPR legislates for, and that is single customer view. And for those that aren't as geeky about it as me, what that means is that there's one core copy of your data, and you farm it out, but it always comes back to one copy.
Yeah.
And so if somebody says, what we've done with data, where's it gone, who've used it with, etc., you can present it all in one go.
Yeah.
And it's asking you to take responsibility as well for your data. So to give you an example of quite how far data can go, I had a little bit of a spat with a third-party data breaker because they were using a really old email address. So I asked them and said, can you, I did a subject as a request, can you tell me where my data's gone? And they said, well, we know we've sold it 33 times.
Wow.
But we can't tell you who we sold it to.
Crikey. So it's out there somewhere.
Oh, but it's relatively low grade data. But I had a spare week in August, and I kind of did some of this. You know, I had another one that said I did a subject Masterclass and said, right, okay, and they gave me back a list of 6 companies, one of which was Experian, and I can't recommend that you try and do a B2B subject access request with Experian. Can't recommend it.
No.
It took a lot of time and a lot of supervisors. And so I went and checked on these companies that they said they'd sold my data to.
Yeah.
Of them, 2 of the companies didn't exist. 3 of the companies said they had never bought any data from this sort of company, and 1 didn't reply. And so, so you got to don't lie either. Be honest, be transparent. But it meant that they actually didn't know. They you know, and they were in the business of selling data, and they didn't know.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like a cautionary tale for event companies that are buying data.
Sure. Yeah. Be really careful.
Be really careful. Be really, really careful, because buying dirty data is like putting a drop of oil into your water source. The minute you buy dirty data, your entire database is dirty. Go back to how we introduced this whole discussion. Data is your most important asset, and therefore it needs to be shiny, it needs to be beautiful, you need to polish it, you need to look after it, you need to nurture it, you need to make sure that you've only got the data that you really truly want, that really is going to be the engine for your business.
And I suppose if people not just value their businesses, but people are in business to make money. And if they want to make money and they want to make good profit and they want to be a successful business, you want to target people accurately. You want to target people who are relevant to your event in this instance. You know, you want to target people who, you know, genuinely have an interest in what you do as an event, and which sort of renders it a bit pointless just obtaining data willy-nilly, if you forgive the phrase.
Yeah. So I spoke at a data protection conference not very long ago, and I can't remember the gentleman's name, which I apologise profusely, but he's a senior marketing director sitting at board level, and he said about the GDPR, he said, I am tired. I am really, really, really tired of going into a board meeting and reporting response rates of 0.01% to a particular campaign, because someone thinks that quantity beats quality.
Yeah.
They said, now I have all the excuse I need to say to these people, we are going to really work out who our customers are, and we are going to live, breathe, and feel those customers, and what motivates them, and really work on building good, strong, solid, quiet relationships with them. Because what I'm going to use a big data phrase, but come back to me. I'm going to explain that a bit more. What happens with big data is people think it's voluminous data, lots of data. That's how they describe big data. Yeah. And so by virtue of the fact, if you shout really loud and you throw enough mud, some of it.
Yeah.
But all that does is that everybody is shouting really loud and everybody else is throwing mud. And so what the data protection legislation that's come in has been a really good reset button. And I have one client who they had a moment of doom when they're kind of like going, how are we going to work this out? And okay, well, but we have to. And they've done it, but we're still in the compliance journey. We will be in the compliance journey forever because that's how it works.
Yeah.
And they, I had a meeting with the CEO 3 weeks ago, and he said thank you, which was really quite lovely because don't often get a thank you. But he said that what we've done is we had removed all of the noise from the business.
Yeah.
We had removed the got to email 100,000 people, got to do this, got to do that, to working out who the people they really, really, really wanted to talk to.
Sure.
And because they had narrowed down who they really, really, really wanted to talk to, and were getting rid of the chaff very quickly. They pulled their retention policies down. They keep the data for much less time, because they were getting rid of that. They had strong databases to make sure that if somebody said that they wanted to speak to them, that they weren't coming back onto the database constantly. Their sales team, their sales have gone up, but more importantly, the business has changed direction because the business is now able to, it's not fighting the noise, it's not fighting constantly, it has a much clearer head, and they are now, rather than just looking at their navel in terms of what email can I broadcast tomorrow, they are now planning much further in advance because they're looking at much longer chains of communication, and he did say as a whole, he said as a whole, we are a much happier, forward-moving company.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've ever listened to this here ramshackle podcast in the past, Helen, I do love a wild analogy, and listening to you talk about that it brings the restaurant analogy to mind, and the subject of a menu. And I found that historically, some of the best meals I've ever had have been in restaurants that have a very minimal menu, a very small amount of choice, because what I've tend to find over the years is that those restaurants really know their identity. They said, this is what we offer. We do these 4 or 5 things really, really well, and that's it. The restaurants that have 400 different options on a 10-page menu are the ones that don't really know what they're doing, and they're trying to do a lot of things, and they're doing a lot of things really badly as opposed to doing a handful of things really well. And that's my wild analogy for today's podcast. Is the restaurant
but I like it. You did in chasing big data and in the large quantities, right, mechanism. What I want to say was they're actually chasing thick data.
Yeah.
And thick, you can take it as a really badly phrased way of saying it's not greatly intelligent data, but also it's glutinous. It drags you down. It's not that useful. Where what you want, the Speedy Gonzales data, don't you? You want stuff that works with you. You really want to know your customers. If we think about in the event industry, the events that have got longevity, they are the ones that have moved with their audience because they know their audience, which means that they probably, although they may not have been managing their data in the most optimal way, but they probably have been looking after their data, and they have been watching how it is working, and they are constantly offering new things for their customers, or they're just talking in the right way to the right people, rather than in the good old days of for 8-page conference brochures, the big gatefold, where basically you had to tell so many stories to so many people in order to get a few of them on through the door.
It's changed massively. Helen, before as we move on with time today, there's something, a particular subject or a particular item that I wanted to talk about on the podcast, if you're okay for a few minutes to talk about, and that is the subject of ICO registration. And I'll put it into a bit of context first of all before we come over to you for a bit of an outline view on this. I work as a freelancer in the events industry, so I will work for different people at different times of the year for several days, sometimes for one day, but often as part of that role and doing ops for people and facilitating conferences and things like that, I'm given access to data. I need to either contact people or see details of people. And it was brought to my attention a few months ago that it was really important that I'm now ICO registered. I'm sure that there will be similar people in a similar position to me listening to the podcast today who work in a similar capacity. Could you just perhaps explain to them a little bit about what the ICO is if they're not familiar with it, and why it's so important to be registered with them?
All right, okay, so the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, is the statutory authority for the UK. All 28 countries currently in the EU have a statutory authority. If you're in places like Germany, there's one per region. They monitor, they regulate the data protection. They also regulate freedom of information. So it's where people go to complain. They advise on policy. They can audit. They can fight. They're the organisation that issues the fine. But they are also there to help and advise. And if you are a data controller or a data processor, if you pass a certain criteria, then you are required by law to register with them.
Right.
If you think that this might be the case for you, then you can go onto the ICO website, and there's a little bit that says registration, and you can go through the little questionnaire you can fill in, which will tell you whether you need to register or not. That's fine, but most people will answer the questions in the way they think that gets them out of it.
Yeah.
Don't. Do not try and go fob these guys off, because they have lots of little nasty surprises up their sleeve. One of the things, and I find this a lot with charities. I work with one organisation that works with charities to manage something on their behalf, and the charities say we have an exemption, we don't have to register. and say, yes, you don't for yourself as a charity, you don't, but you've got our data,
Yeah.
which an operation outside of your jurisdiction as a charity, and therefore you must register. So it's not onerous. I think you've done it now, haven't you?
I certainly have, and I
Yeah.
can back up exactly what you've just said, as I did at the masterclass for the Event Tech Live exhibitors. It took me about 5 minutes. I had to answer some simple questions about what sort of data I'm given access to, what my own job role is, do I work for myself or do I have any employees, etc., etc. And I populated everything as honestly as possible, and submitted the registration. And as a freelancer, as a sole trader, I am charged the princely sum of £40 a year, or £35 if I commit to a direct debit. And that's me registered.
Yeah. So, and I would advise everyone to commit to a direct debit, because then it comes out whether you remember or not.
Mm-hmm.
And because the fines for not paying start at £400 and go up to 4,350. And Farrow and Ball got fined this year because they forgot to renew their registration.
Yeah.
And their excuse was the person that did it was on holiday. They said, but the direct debit would have solved that problem. So
There we go. Yeah.
yeah. So, but I also want to say that as a data protection officer, I know that I'm talking to one or two suppliers at the Masterclass. They said we've never been asked by anybody for our ICA registration number. And I said, well, as a data protection officer, I always ask every supplier for it as part of the data sharing agreement. Part of we do a thing called the kind of like overview of processing before we issue the sharing agreement or processing agreement. And for me, it's a measure of how seriously you take data protection.
Yeah.
If you aren't registered, particularly if I'm in a role where public money is involved, you aren't getting onto the procurement list.
Yeah.
Because it means that that you don't take data protection as seriously as we do. I am registered with the ICO. I handle no data at all, but it isn't worth my while not to be registered.
Yeah, given what you do for a living, it just makes sense.
Yeah, so but it's a fact for me. It's a fail safe. But for £35 a year, it's fine. So it's also important that you don't try and fox the system. As you said, it's cost you £35. A lot of companies, majority of companies in the event industry will be a tier 2. So you're a tier 1. A tier 2 costs the princely sum of £60 a year. But if you fall into tier 2, you can afford £60 a year.
Yeah.
It's really important that you keep your address up to date. It's really important that if you've got a data protection officer, and you have to have one, that they are registered there, and that you are the right tier. So you do not want to get caught out by something that is a cheapy, really, really bit of admin. But equally, I work with companies that have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds becoming compliant, hundreds and hundreds of hours of management time. Why are you going to then go and work with somebody or an organisation or use their services who couldn't give or couldn't make the effort to spend £40?
Exactly right. And I suspect as more companies become aware of this, as more event organisers become aware of this, and just going back to my own circumstance as a freelance, I'm a one-man band, as many other people who work in the events industry, individual freelancers, that I suspect that this is going to be something that will be more and more of a criteria. You won't get a gig working with somebody on an event unless you can show that you are registered.
Yeah, for me, it's just a box. It's just a box to tick. If you're going to get some data, then I want to know that you've done that. You're somewhere in the frame. It really isn't hard, and should be something that everybody should do. If I was asking you to spend £3,000, then then we'd have to have much more rigid reason. But I'm not, so.
Absolutely, it's less than what most people would spend on a good Saturday night out now if they went out around town.
This is at 2 copies in Starbucks.
Absolutely. And for anybody that's interested, ico.org.uk is the website. ico.org.uk is the website to go to if you do want to register and find out a little bit more about that. But as I said, and as Helen has said, it's a quick process. It's an easy process. Populate your details. Do it as honestly as possible. Get registered. It's really worthwhile. It's a simple thing to do, and in the long run, it will no doubt serve you really well if you work in the industry. Helen, just
to say one more thing. If you want to check whether somebody is registered, they also, if you put register of fee payers into that same website, you can go and check whether somebody has a valid registration, because I do that. So somebody might give me a registration number, but I will go and check. Where I have had a couple of organisations said, yes, we're registered, and I said, did you realise this is an annual fee, don't you? And they went, no, we paid it 2 years ago. Yes, you are expected to renew. And just one last thing on this particular point.
Yeah.
If where companies get into trouble is when somebody reports them to the ICO. So if you haven't handled a subject access request properly, or somebody thinks that you continue to spam email them when you've asked them not to, and all these kind of things, where they go to report you is the ICO. The first thing the ICO does is to go and look up your registration details. If you are not on there, then you are in the net.
There we go.
They've got you. So, so if you've got 4,500 people on your database, that's 4,500 people who could rat you in. So that's quite high probabilities. So you kind of like go with that.
Take the advice, people. Take the advice. Helen, finally, before we wrap up today's episode, tell us if somebody wants to get in touch directly with you and your organisation, Data Oversight, how do they find you guys if they want to speak to you about the services that you offer?
Okay, so we've got a really dodgy website because time is spent doing things with clients. So dataoversight.uk, you can find us there, or info@dataoversight.uk. Or you can come and find me on LinkedIn. I'm really, really happy to link to people on LinkedIn, because then they get to see my constant diatribes. Well, no, but I currently spend quite a lot of time commentating upon data privacy and data ethics, because that's something that really interests me. You find me on LinkedIn. My name is spelled with a double L, so find it. But please, if you request to link to me, tell me that you heard me on the podcast, because otherwise I will ignore you.
Excellent. Helen, thank you very much for joining us today. I know that Helen's joining us from outside the University of Hertfordshire with a lecture looming in the next 45 minutes or so. So she's been very generous with her time this morning to squeeze us in as the first recording of the day before today's lecture starts. So Helen, thank you very much for joining the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
If you're watching the podcast on eventindustrynews.com, have a little click around, see some of the latest features and special supplements that have been produced. But don't forget that you can also go to your chosen podcast platform and listen to audio-only versions of all of the podcasts, go right back to where we began. The flip side to that, of course, is if you are listening to today's podcast via one of those podcast platforms, get over to eventindustrynews.com, where you can see videos of all the podcasts that we've done, and also find out about some of the features, latest news, and what's happening in the world of the events industry in the UK and indeed further afield. But that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thanks very much again to our guest today, Hellen Beveridge from Data Oversight, talking about data protection issues within the events industry. We will see you on the next issue of the podcast. My name's James Dickson. Thank you very much.